Welcome to our presentation on the updated NHS Standard Contracts for 2017 to 19. My name is Alistair Hill. I'm the lead for the NHS Standard Contract at NHS England, and you'll shortly be hearing from my colleague Michelle Coleman. We've divided our presentation into three sections. So in this first one, I'll talk a bit about the basic principles of the contract, what it's for and when it must be used. I'll cover the difference between the traditional full-length version of the contract and the new shorter form version that we've issued for the first time in 16-17. And then I'll say a little bit about grant agreements and subcontracts. Then I'll hand over to Michelle, who will talk about the e-contract system, about the range of supporting tools and publications we're providing alongside the contract, and also something about where to go for advice and support. And finally, in this section, Michelle will hand back to me to talk a little bit about processes for dispute resolution. So, moving on then, what's the standard contract for and when should it be used? So the NHS Standard Contract is the model commissioning contract which NHS England publishes for use by NHS commissioners, that's itself and clinical commissioning groups, when commissioning clinical services other than primary care. Use of the contract is actually mandatory. It's something we publish under the standing rules regulations, and CCGs must use it. It's not an option. But it's a flexible beast. The contract isn't a straitjacket. It's got an awful lot of scope for local completion. So the bulk of the particulars, the schedules in the particulars in the contract are for local completion, and the service conditions in the contract don't apply in a one-size-fits-all manner. They apply taking account of the service categories that have been selected. So if you've selected acute services, you'll get one set of tailored service conditions, whereas if you've selected mental health service, for instance, then you'll get a slightly different set. So it's not a one-size-fits-all contract. But I would say it's really important for commissioners to remember, don't put in place your own locally drafted contracts or service level agreements instead of the standard contract, and don't change the mandated national wording that the contract contains. So the contract comes now in both full-length and shorter form versions, and I'd like to say a little bit about those and when to use each one. So the shorter form version was a new product for 2016-17. It has the same structure and clause and schedule numbering system as the full-length version, but a range of the specific policy requirements on providers are omitted from the shorter form, and the contract management processes in the shorter form are much more simple. So those are the main differences. The shorter form version is intended for use when commissioning particular services only, and we'll come on to that on the next slide. And it's aimed generally at services and contracts with a lower financial value. We've not set a specific threshold for that, but we're talking about using it when what's being commissioned is a single community-based service, say, or a small package of such services, not for the complicated mix of services that a big NHS trust might provide, say. So bear that in mind in terms of its use. Overall, the idea with the shorter form contract is that it's both easier to understand and much simpler, less onerous for the provider to deliver. And the idea of what we're trying to do here is to reduce, where we can, the complexity and burden involved in providers doing business with the NHS. So this really is more about those small providers, the voluntary sector organisations, the non-NHS bodies like pharmacies or care homes or hospices, who aren't used to doing business so much with the NHS compared to big NHS trusts. So to say a little bit more then about when to use which version. So the full-length version must be used in certain circumstances, particularly where what you're commissioning is acute or other inpatient services, mental health, inpatient and secure services, cancer services, A&E, minor injuries, NHS 111 or ambulance services. For all of those, the full-length contract must be used because only the full-length contract contains the necessary provisions that relate to those services. On the other hand, the shorter form may be used for commissioning any of the list on the right-hand side of this slide. So non-inpatient mental health and learning disability services, the full range of community services, end-of-life care outside an acute hospital, care home, care placements, diagnostic screening and pathology, and patient transport. So you've got a pretty clear set of distinctions for when the short form may be used and when the full-length version must be used. In general terms, the changes that we've made to the full-length contract for 1719, which we're going to come on to talk about later in our presentation, have been carried over into the shorter form version where that's relevant and appropriate. Not all of them have, but some of them have. But there's one significant design change to the shorter form version which we've made for 1719. We've included the detailed provisions that relate to payment for services where there's a national price under the national tariff payment system. Now that's adding back quite a bit of text, and the reason we've done that is to respond to feedback we'd had which said we were artificially narrowing the situations in which the shorter form contract could be used. So particularly, we were preventing it from being used where there were maybe relatively small contracts for community-based diagnostic services in place, where there is a national price quite often under the tariff, and we were saying, no, you can't use the shorter form contract for that because we haven't set it up to include the provisions about national prices. So that's the thing we've changed for 2017 to 19 in the shorter form version. What I would say is, be careful about this. This doesn't mean that you can use the shorter form version for commissioning acute services covered by national prices. It's not intended for that purpose, so please don't do that. And remember as well that the new wording we've added back into the shorter form contract around national prices, it does make the contract that bit longer and that bit more complicated. So please do use the e-contract system to tailor your contract documentation so that the national price wording only appears in those contracts where it's relevant and needed and drops out and doesn't clutter up other contracts where it's not required. So I'm going to say a little now about two other things, grant agreements and subcontracts. So with grant agreements, I suppose the main message is for commissioners to remember that they do have the power to make grants to voluntary sector organisations rather than necessarily always thinking they have to place a contract instead. And there are some situations where a grant approach is likely to be more appropriate than using the standard contract, particularly, and this is the example we often give, if a CCG is, for instance, contributing partially to the costs of a hospice, rather than commissioning the whole of the hospice's services and paying the full cost of those services, then that's the sort of situation where a grant agreement is probably more appropriate than the contract. So bear that in mind. We do publish a model grant agreement and we provide guidance with that, and they're both available on our website. So then subcontracts. Well, the standard contract is a contract between the commissioner and the provider. It's not intended as a subcontract or a provider-to-provider contract. Providers, of course, can subcontract under the NHS Standard Contract. They may choose to employ another organisation to deliver part of the services for them, basically. And the contract sets out the rules on subcontracting at General Condition 12. So, in the past, we have made a template model subcontract available for people to use, and we're planning to do that again for 1719. It's not a mandatory form, its use isn't required, but we do think it's a reliable way of passing down the obligations from the main commissioning contract and making sure they appear as appropriate in any subcontract. So do have a look at it. We'll be publishing that as soon as we can on the website, and for the first time, as well as producing a subcontract to go with the full-length version, we're also planning for this year to produce one to go with the shorter form version of the contract too. Finally, from me in this section for now, a little piece about what we call non-contract activity. So, Stating the obvious, as a general rule, we'd expect commissioners to put in place a written contract in the form of the full-length or shorter form version of the standard contract whenever they commission a relevant clinical service from a provider. And that's really regardless of how much the service is worth or how long it's going to be provided for. The bottom line is, if you're buying a clinical service, you ought to aim to have a contract in place. However, there are clearly going to be situations where that doesn't work and a provider does have to undertake some sort of patient care or treatment without there being a written contract in place with the CCG that is responsible for that patient. So the most obvious example of that is when a patient is far from home on holiday, is taken ill, requires emergency admission to hospital in somewhere 200 or 300 miles from home. The chances are there won't be a written contract in place for that. That's the scenario we call non-contract activity. And the thing I wanted to point you towards here is that the detailed arrangements around how non-contract activity is expected to be handled are set out in the Who Pays guidance. So not in detail in our contract technical guidance, but in the separate Who Pays guidance, and you can see the link to that on the slide. In particular, do look at paragraphs 38 to 46 of that guidance, which talk about the fact that the non-contract activity is carried out on the basis of the terms and conditions of the provider's contract with its local host commissioner. So the requirements in that contract apply to non-contract activity too, and particularly the requirements in terms of the timescales for payment and reconciliation. So I'm now going to hand over to Michelle, who's going to talk about the e-contract and other matters.
Hello, my name is Michelle Coleman and I work with Alistair Hill on the NHS Standard Contract team at NHS England. My job title is NHS Standard Contract Manager and Engagement Lead. The first thing we're going to talk about is the e-contract system, and then I'm going to talk about what we've published already on our website and what is to come, and then I'm going to talk a bit about how you can find further help and guidance from the NHS Standard Contract team. So starting with the e-contract. So the e-contract system will remain largely unchanged for 2017-19, as most stakeholders have told us that they like the simple and easy to use system. So the system will host both the full length and the short form contracts and will remain essentially a document generation system. So no login or password is required to access e-contract, and it can be used by commissioners and by providers alike. The e-contract functionality is largely unchanged. So a user works through a series of screens, inputting some basic information and ticking boxes to indicate service categories and contract options. The system then generates a set of partially completed and tailored particulars in Word and a set of tailored service conditions in PDF. The user then saves these to their local drive and completes the population of the particulars later locally, or can create a contract template for later use. So the system retains what were always intended to be the benefits of e-contract, a quick and efficient way of creating tailored contract documents. The thing that has changed for 17-19 is the addition of national pricing for the shorter form contract. The e-contract URL is the same, and there it is on the slide, and a user guide is presented on the portal so that you can work your way through it to create e-contracts. Help and assistance is available through the e-contract email address, and again that is on the slide, and e-contract will go live as soon as possible following the publication of the contracts. We'll also be providing training by webinar, and we'll email people separately about this once the e-contract system is live. Looking at publication guidance and support. So, what have we published so far on our 17-18 webpage? Obviously the final contracts have been published alongside the final technical guidance and the short form user guide. We've also published the model collaborative commissioning agreements, the optional pensions and primary care schedules, and the contract management forms. This video presentation, the slides and the transcript are also available, as are the local variations guidance. To come, obviously the e-contract system is to go live, and that will host the user guide on the same portal. The national variations will be published shortly, as will the updated model subcontracts for use with a full-length contract and with a short form contract. New for 1719 will be publishing the short form contract as an interactive PDF designed as a training aid. And for help and support, obviously there's a lot of resources available on our webpage, and that's the URL there. Have a look at the contract technical guidance and at the short form contract user guide. Also have a look at the e-contract user guide, which will be hosted on the e-contract portal when it goes live shortly. If you have any queries on the NHS Standard Contract, they can be sent to nhscb.contractshelp@nhs.net, and queries on the e-contract system can be sent to england.econtract@nhs.net. Please do give us feedback on this video presentation. Let us know what you thought and how it went down by emailing the Contracts Engagement email address, which is england.contractsengagement@nhs.net. Now I'm going to hand back to Alistair, who's going to talk to you about dispute resolution.
Thanks, Michelle. So, as Michelle said, I'm just going to say a word or two about dispute resolution processes. So clearly, once you've got a signed and agreed contract, the dispute resolution procedure within that contract applies. So if you fall out, then General Condition 14 of the contract tells you how you handle a dispute resolution where you have a signed contract in place. But there is a different scenario where what happens is that the commissioner and the provider are unable to agree a new contract where their old contract is expiring. And that can be a difficult scenario in an NHS context because the option to walk away and simply not provide services for patients doesn't really exist so readily. So for that scenario, you can't use the dispute resolution process in the contract because this is about a new contract that you haven't agreed yet. So instead, NHS England and NHS Improvement have published again for 1719 a separate dispute resolution procedure relating to failure to agree new contracts. That's set out as an annex to the main planning guidance, and the web link to it is on the screen. So as part of that process and timescale for the dispute resolution procedure, there's a deadline which you will all know, have engraved on your hearts already, for contract signature, a very challenging deadline of the 23rd of December. And following that then, the deadline for submission of paperwork into this joint arbitration process is the 9th of January 2017. So that's a date to bear in mind. A word or two then about ways of minimising disputes, because of course disputes are time consuming and they're expensive, and you don't want to go down that route unless you absolutely have to. So the first thing to emphasise really is that if it comes to an arbitration under the joint NHS Improvement NHS England procedure, the first point of reference for the arbitration panel is going to be, what does the national guidance say about a particular issue in dispute? So whether that's our contract technical guidance, the national tariff guidance, or the guidance on sequin schemes, the first thing the panel will be looking at is, are these people doing what it says in the national guidance? So a first piece of really strong advice would be, anyone who's thinking about going into dispute on an issue, make sure you understand what the national guidance says and that you're complying reasonably with that guidance. Otherwise, you're likely to lose. So, where can you get advice on those sorts of technical issues? Well, as Michelle was saying earlier, there's an awful lot of that in our standard contract technical guidance, which is available on the website. And if the technical guidance doesn't provide you with the answers, do email our contracts help email address. And there are similar addresses and sources of advice and guidance on the slide now relating to sequin and the national tariff system. Clearly, if you approach any of those email addresses with a question and ask for an answer, you'll get a response. But do bear in mind that if a commissioner asks one question one way, with one bit of backing information, and the provider asks a slightly different question a slightly different way, giving slightly different information, don't be surprised if you get slightly different responses. So again, a tip would be, where you can, try to make a joint approach. If you're clear about the issue that you're disagreeing about, if you can state it clearly to us, from commissioner and provider combined, then we've got more chance of giving you one clear answer on the basis of a shared submission of evidence, as it were. So I hope that makes sense as a way forward with dispute resolution. So that's the end of the first section of our presentation on the new standard contracts. Please do go on and look at the second and third sections, where we'll talk about new policy requirements that have been included in the contract and aspects of using and managing the contract in practice. And thank you very much for listening.